In the fall of 1971, a survey crew mapping a proposed logging route in the Boston Mountains of northwest Arkansas walked into a clearing that was not on any map. Sitting at the center of that clearing was a cabin, squared timber, chinked with mortar that had no business existing in that region, a stone chimney that rose straight and true after what the state geologist would later estimate was at least 140 years of standing empty. The door was still on its hinges. The roof had not collapsed. And inside, on a table made from a single slab of white oak, a lantern was sitting upright, with oil still in the reservoir. The men who found it did not stay long. One of them, a timber cruiser named Elmer Cawthron, walked out of that clearing and refused to go back in, even for the paycheck. He told his foreman that the cabin was, quote, standing wrong. That was the phrase he used, standing wrong. He would not explain what he meant. He would not sit in the same room as a photograph of it. And when he died in the winter of 1988, he left instructions in his will that any papers relating to his time with the Forest Service were to be burned before his funeral. His widow followed that instruction. 6 weeks later, when a second team was sent in to document the site for the Forest Service, the cabin was still there. The lantern was gone. The table was gone. The door had been closed from the inside. The Ozark Highlands are older than almost any landmass on the North American continent. The Boston Mountains, which form the northern rim of that plateau, were already ancient when the Appalachians were still being pushed up out of the sea floor. And the settler history of that region is, on paper, straightforward. French trappers moved through in the 1700s. American squatters followed after the Louisiana Purchase. By 1830, the population was thin but consistent. Farmers, hunters, distillers, and a scattering of trappers who worked the deep hollows where the black bear and the river otter were still plentiful. The cabin in the clearing does not fit any of that history. It does not fit the timeline. It does not fit the geography. It does not fit the pattern of every other homestead the Forest Service had ever documented in that stretch of country. And the reasons it does not fit are the reasons Elmer Cawthron would not go back. Start with the timber itself. The logs used to build that cabin were white oak, squared on four sides with what the 1974 assessment described as, quote, an unusually consistent adze pattern suggesting either mechanized milling or a level of hand craftsmanship not documented in the region during the estimated construction period. The logs were also too long. The average white oak available to a trapper in that region in 1830 would have topped out around 18 feet of usable timber. The logs in the cabin walls averaged 26 feet, every single one. A 26-foot log of squared white oak in that country, in that era, was not a thing a lone man produced with a felling axe and a broadaxe over a winter. It was a thing that required a team, a mill, and a road capable of moving it. The clearing had no road. There is no record of a mill within 12 miles of the site in any decade of the 19th century. There is no record of a team of oxen having been contracted for any hauling in that particular hollow, in any surviving county ledger, at any point before the Civil War. And yet the logs were there. 16 of them, in the four walls, all of them squared on four sides with the same tool, all of them of the same length, all of them cut from trees that had grown, according to the ring analysis the Forest Service commissioned in 1972, somewhere between 40 and 60 miles south of where the cabin stood. The nearest suitable stand of white oak of the required size, in 1830, was on the other side of the Buffalo River. The Buffalo River, in that stretch, is not a river a man carries a 26-foot log across. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what was removed from that Ozark clearing, the field notes the survey crew filed before the report was reclassified, the mortar analysis that the University of Arkansas Geology Department completed in 1974, and the internal Forest Service memo naming the 4 men who were sent back to close the site, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Then there is the chimney. Ozark stone chimneys from that era were dry laid or bound with clay-lime mortar mixed on site, using materials a settler could source from within a day's walk of his own front door. lime burned from local limestone, sand from a creek bed, clay from a hillside. The formulas varied from valley to valley, and a trained mason can, even today, tell you roughly where in the Ozarks a chimney was built just by looking at the mortar. The mortar in this chimney was analyzed by the University of Arkansas in 1974. The report, which was later pulled from the department's public archive and replaced with a shorter summary, identified the binding agent as a hydraulic lime cement of a formulation that was not commercially available in the United States until the 1890s, 60 years after the cabin was, by every other measure, built. The report also noted that the mortar contained trace elements that did not match any known limestone deposit within 400 miles of the site. The report is dated. The samples are logged. 2 of the 3 researchers who signed off on the analysis are dead. The third, a retired professor named Willem Boyd, gave a single interview in 2003 to a graduate student writing a thesis on early Arkansas building materials. Boyd would only say that the mortar sample they received in 1974 was, in his words, the strangest piece of masonry material he had ever examined in a career of examining strange things. He would not elaborate. The graduate student's thesis was completed and shelved. It has since been removed from the university's digital catalogue. Boyd did, however, allow the student to look at the original testing sheets before the interview ended. The sheets listed the standard composition tests, the acid reactivity tests, and the thin section petrographic tests. All had been completed and signed off, but at the bottom of the third sheet, in a different hand from the rest, was a line of writing that read, "Sample resistant to standard chemical dating." The student asked Boyd what that meant. Boyd said he did not want to answer, and he ended the interview. The mortar sample itself, according to the last logged reference in the department's transfer records, was moved out of the University of Arkansas storage facility in the summer of 1976. The receiving agency is not named. The line where the agency's name should appear is blank. The signature of the person who authorized the transfer is legible, however. It belongs to a man who was not, at any point on file, an employee of the University of Arkansas. The signature is real. The name behind it is not. The second survey team, the one sent in 6 weeks after the first, was led by a Forest Service field supervisor named Randall Ash. Ash was a Korean War veteran, a man his colleagues described as impossible to unsettle. He had personally documented over 400 abandoned homesteads across the southern Ozarks. He had walked into cabins where hunters had died in their sleep. He had catalogued the belongings of families who had left the mountains during the Depression and never come back. He had seen everything a Forest Service man in that country could reasonably expect to see. What he filed on the trapper's cabin in the Boston Mountains was, according to a former colleague who spoke on Background in 1996, the only report Ash ever handed in without a photograph attached. Ash's team entered the cabin on the 2nd day of December, 1971. The temperature that morning was recorded at 21 degrees Fahrenheit. There was 6 inches of dry snow on the ground in the surrounding forest. Inside the cabin, according to Ash's written notes, the temperature was measurably warmer. Not by a few degrees, by enough that one of his men, a young Forest Service technician named Curtis Melbourne, removed his coat within the first 5 minutes and did not put it back on until they left. Melbourne later told his brother that the air inside the cabin did not feel like heated air. He said it felt like the air on a summer afternoon that had somehow been trapped between the walls and forgotten. There was no fire in the fireplace. There had been no fire in that fireplace, according to the ash analysis done later, for at least a century. The warmth had no source. The interior was a single room, roughly 16 feet by 22. The floor was made of the same white oak as the walls, and the boards were tongue and groove, which was again inconsistent with the estimated construction date. There was no bed, there was no stove, only the fireplace. There were no personal effects of the kind you would expect in a trapper's cabin. No traps, no pelts, no powder horn, no knife, no coat on a peg, no boots by the door, no cookware, no tinderbox, no axe, no candle. Nothing that suggested a human being had ever lived there in the ordinary sense of living. It was, according to Ash's report, less like an abandoned dwelling and more like a room that had been built for a purpose other than living, and then closed. Before we move on to what was carved into those walls, stop for a second. What you just heard about the interior warmth is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Ashfield notebook, the measured temperature differential, the fireplace ash analysis. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. What there was, according to Ash's notes, was writing. On every interior wall, from the floor to a height of approximately 6 feet, the timbers had been carved with lines of text. It was not English. It was not French. Ash, who had studied some German in the service, was certain it was not any Germanic language. The letters were angular. The lines ran horizontally and did not follow any margin. They covered the wood, top to bottom, wall to wall, in what he estimated was between 14 and 16,000 characters. The characters were cut clean, not scratched, not scorched, cut with something that had a very fine edge, at a depth of approximately 1/8 of an inch, with almost no variation across the entire interior. Ash noted that the cuts appeared to have been made in a single continuous session, with no fatigue in the hand and no correction anywhere in the text. He estimated the carving would have required a skilled hand between 300 and 400 hours of work. There was no evidence, anywhere in the cabin, of the tool that had made the cuts. Ash tried to copy a section of the writing into his field notebook. The notebook, recovered decades later at an estate auction, shows 3 attempts to copy the text. Each is scribbled out. On the 4th attempt, Ash gave up. He wrote a single line across the page. It reads, "The characters do not sit still on the wall long enough to draw." He did not explain that either. Ash's team photographed the walls. Those photographs are the ones that were not attached to the final report. The 4 men were inside the cabin for approximately 2 hours. They documented the writing, took the mortar samples, and catalogued the one object left inside since the first survey. Under the floorboards, in a shallow void cut into the joists, was a wooden box. The box was cedar. It was sealed with the same hydraulic lime mortar as the chimney. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had not decayed, was a single item. A ledger. The ledger was leather-bound. The paper was rag stock, high quality, inconsistent with what would have been available to a trapper in the 1830s. The entries were written in an educated hand, in English, and they were dated. The earliest entry was March of 1817, the latest July of 1834. The entries did not describe trapping, farming, hunting, or weather. They described people, by name. 12 names, entered and re-entered across 17 years, with dates next to each and a single column of numbers whose meaning Ash could not determine on sight. Some had a small mark beside them, a single vertical line, cut sharply through the ink. Of the 12 names in that ledger, 9 were later matched to real people in Arkansas territorial records: farmers, a circuit preacher, a ferryman on the White River, 2 women who ran a boarding house in what would become Ozone. All 9 died between 1820 and 1836. All 9 died in ways the county coroners of the time described using the same phrase, over and over, in 9 separate death records filed across 3 counties. Found alone, no apparent cause. One of the deceased, a farmer named Alec Rue, had been found sitting upright in a chair in his own kitchen, with a cup of coffee still warm on the table before him, and no sign of struggle. Another, a preacher named Whitfield Corcoran, had been found kneeling in the loft of his own barn, hands folded, with no explanation as to why he had climbed the ladder. The dates of these deaths, in every documented case, matched the dates written next to the corresponding names in the ledger, sometimes to the day, sometimes off by 24 hours, in a direction the ledger's author could not have predicted unless he had known the death was coming. The 3 names that could not be matched to any territorial record were the 3 names in the ledger with the vertical mark cut next to them. Ash filed his report on December 9th. On December 22nd, it was reclassified and sealed at the regional level. The photographs were separated from the report and, according to the 1,996 background source, transferred to a federal storage facility outside Denver. The cabin site was removed from the proposed logging route. The 4 men on Ash's team were reassigned within 6 months. Ash was moved to an administrative post in Little Rock and took early retirement in 1976. He died in 1991. His personal papers, which his family attempted to donate to the University of Arkansas, were declined without a stated reason. In March of 1972, a private landowner named Henry Culps, whose family had held title to the surrounding acreage since the 1890s, hired a small crew to demolish the cabin. He had heard rumors from the timbermen, and he wanted it gone before someone got curious. His crew of 4 reached the clearing on March 11th. They did not begin work. According to the account Culps gave to a local newspaper reporter 12 years later, the crew returned to his farmhouse that evening and told him the cabin was gone. Not damaged, not collapsed, gone. The clearing was empty. The stone chimney, which had weighed several tons, was not on the ground and was not scattered. The timbers were not there. The foundation stones were not there. The soil showed no sign of disturbance. There was only the clearing, the tree line, and a single depression in the centre of the ground that measured, according to one of the 4 men, approximately 16 feet by 22. The exact dimensions of the cabin's floor plan. Culps did not press the matter. The men were paid. The story did not appear in any newspaper until 1984, and by then 2 of the 4 crew were dead. The 4th was Culps's own nephew, who confirmed the account and added one detail his uncle had omitted. When they reached the clearing on March 11th, before they saw the cabin was gone, the depression in the ground was already there. It had rained the night before. No water pooled in it. The clearing is still there. It sits on land transferred, through a series of quiet acquisitions in the 1980s, to a holding company registered in Delaware. The parent has no public officer, and according to 2 hunters who crossed onto it by accident in the last 15 years, the interior of that clearing, even in January under snow, is measurably warmer than the surrounding forest. One of them, Ross Delaney, told a podcast interviewer in 2019 that his thermometer read 53 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of the clearing when the surrounding air was reading 28. His dog, a walker hound that had never refused a command in 6 years of hunting, would not step past the tree line. The ledger, the mortar sample, and Ash's notes are, according to the last public reference, held in a federal document facility outside Denver. The photographs have not been seen since 1972. The 3 names in the ledger marked with a vertical line have never been identified. Cross-referenced against every surviving territorial record in Arkansas, Missouri, and what was then Indian Territory, they produced no matches. Those 3 names correspond to no human being documented as ever having lived in the region, and the phrase Elmer Cawthron used, "standing wrong," appears in the margin of one of Ash's field notebooks, in Ash's own handwriting, next to a rough sketch of the cabin's front elevation. He wrote it once. He circled it. He did not explain what he meant. There is a version of this story that ends with the cabin being a hoax, a late edition, built in the 1960s by someone with too much time and access to old timber. But the mortar analysis does not support that. The ledger entries, cross-referenced against real death records, do not either. The measured warmth of the clearing does not. And the depression in the soil, which appeared before the demolition crew arrived and measured the exact footprint of a cabin that no longer existed, does not either. What is left is a structure that stood for 140 years in a place where no one built it, containing a record of 12 people no one wrote, sealed with a material that did not exist when it was made. A ledger that predicted the deaths of 9 people to the day, and named 3 more who never existed. A phrase from a timber cruiser who walked out of a clearing in 1971 and refused, for the rest of his life, to go back. Standing wrong. When the graduate student asked Willem Boyd in 2003 why the university had pulled the mortar analysis, Boyd looked at her for a long moment. He said that when they finished the analysis, one of the other researchers had asked a question he could not stop thinking about, even 30 years later. If this mortar could not have existed when the cabin was built, then when was the cabin actually built? Boyd did not have an answer in 1974. He did not have one in 2003 either. Whatever that cabin was, it was not a trapper's cabin. Whatever removed it in 1972 did not leave a footprint, and whatever built it did not leave a signature on the timber. The clearing is still warm. The ledger is still sealed. The 3 unnamed men are still not named. And the Ozarks are still keeping the parts of this story that were never written.